Hello, I'm Dr. Jim Coyle, and this is Lesson 1 for writing notes about human services contacts with clients. This lesson focuses on taking notes during the interview with the client. There's 3 parts of this lesson. First, why take notes at all, and what do you write down? 2 is organizing notes, and 3 is tips for writing notes during interviews. There's some questions about writing notes during interviews, such as why take notes, what do you write down, what's not necessary, and also how do you listen, analyze, and write all at the same time. There are a number of reasons for taking notes during an interview. It helps the worker remember what was said. It helps the worker collect information for assessment and treatment planning. It helps determine what information is still needed. And documenting the client contact provides a guide for a subsequent worker, the basis for case review or consultation, and a summary for a client who requests to read copies of their notes. So what gets written down? Some practical tips are that a summary of the client's statements gets written down. Exact words are usually not necessary, although sometimes helpful. Trying to get the client's exact words throughout the interview is going to take you a lot of time and have you focusing more on note writing than engaging the client. It's not usually necessary to quote clients because a note really is presenting information that all comes from the client anyway. So you want it to be coherent. Sometimes jotting down specific language that a client uses can be helpful. I can remember a client of mine saying to me, as a way of explaining why life really was terrible for them, the client said, "Life sucks and then you die." Well, that "life sucks" became one of the catchwords that they then used during the counseling session. So I would continue to ask the client, well, tell me, what is it about this that sucks? How does your life suck in this regard? And then we moved into kind of going a little bit further than that and said, well, what do you do to make life less suckable? And so using that particular word and that particular phrase became a way of engaging the client and really paying attention to what they were saying. And so sometimes it can be helpful to use particular quotes of words, but it's usually too much difficulty to try and quote whatever the client says. What else gets written down? Identifying information, their name, their age or their approximate age from observation, their occupation, family information. Sometimes this information is collected when the appointment is made, and so you've got it when they come for the appointment and you don't have to ask information about this, except perhaps to check to make sure that it's correct. You want to describe the presenting problem. This is important. You want to know what happens, when it happens, where, how long, how intense, with whom, why, how does it end, and the client's actions or responses to it, what they've done in the past to try and help them with problems like this. All of this is very important information for understanding what you're going to do to help the client address this presenting problem. It can also be helpful to write down the client's current living circumstances. Do they live by themselves? Do they live with family? Where do they live? We don't usually put an address in a interview note. That's usually kept someplace else in the client chart or client information. But if they live in a particular part of town or they live in a rural area, sometimes this can be helpful to note. A history of clients' past responses to stressful or problem situations helps the client begin to take a look at, do they already know some things that may help them with their current presenting problem? What's unnecessary to write down? Many interviews begin with casual or introductory remarks such as talk about the weather, the traffic, finding the office. You don't need to document these in case records. Detailed descriptions of the client's appearance are not generally necessary unless they're unusual or they contribute to your assessment of the presenting problem. If the client is coming and kind of presenting a depressed mood is a real problem, then maybe describing whether their what their personal hygiene is like, whether their hair is combed, whether they're clean, whether their clothes are clean. This could be an important thing that kind of helps you understand at what level of depression are they experiencing. On the other hand, if a client comes and says, well, I'm having some work stress, then describing their very professional work clothing and their appearance probably isn't as necessary. On the other hand, if they were really looking disheveled and, we're having some issues in terms of dirty clothing or, uncleanness in terms of their person, maybe this situation at work is a bit more stressful than you think. Writing down that the client paused or describing the client's facial expressions or their requests for more information about the worker's questions are not necessary if this is part of the worker or the client just trying to understand and interact with the worker. On the other hand, in some cases, this could be important. And so you have to make an assessment about, is this going to be related to your interpretation, your judgment about what's going on and how the client's presenting problem occurs and their ability to handle it. You don't write down the worker's statements, the worker's questions, the worker's behavior in a note because a note documents what the client says. It's not important for you to prove that you're asking the right questions or that you kind of know how to do an interview. It's assumed that if you're in this position in the workplace that you do have some expertise in terms of that. On the other hand, sometimes you can put down that the client responded to a particular question when it seemed that the client was unwilling to divulge that information until the worker specifically questioned it. That may actually influence your interpretation of the client's characteristics and their presenting problem. So how do you take notes? First of all, it's really helpful to just tell the client. You're taking notes to make sure that you remember all the details being mentioned during the interview. This is a very reasonable thing to do. Handwriting notes is generally less distracting, although that could be my observation coming from an old guy who's done that before and is not real good at taking notes on a tablet or a phone or something like that. Maybe my younger colleagues would find that a lot easier to do than I would. A practical tip is to summarize what the client says without interpreting their meaning. When you are writing down what a client says, your goal is to just get an objective record of what the client is presenting, rather than your interpretation of what the client is presenting. You're going to write that a little bit later on in the assessment section, but that's not so much in the notes you take because the notes are describing what the client says, what the client does. Ask the client for more information or to repeat what was said if you realize when you're writing things down that you're unsure. Use abbreviations or shortened forms to reduce the time you need to write accurate notes, but make sure you can read the notes. Taking 5 to 10 seconds to write notes before asking the next question is pretty reasonable, and most clients will go along with you because they realize that you're trying to help them. Listening, engaging, analyzing, and note-taking? Yes, it's challenging to do everything simultaneously. But a practical tip is you do get better with practice. Sometimes you can analyze further after the interview, and this particularly happens with new workers, human service workers, when they discuss their analysis with their supervisor or with a colleague, and they're trying to work things out when they have a little bit more time after the interview is over. So the second point is organizing notes. Why do you organize, and how do you do it? Well, organizing information brings similar types of information together, and this helps the worker to notice when factors may influence each other, what information is known and what is unknown, what categories of information need more detail versus categories which do not appear to influence the presenting problem. Sometimes when the client is telling you their story, you'll ask them about their family and what's going on with their family, and you realize that their description of that suggests that the stress they're experiencing at work or the difficulty they're having with a friend probably is not similar to what's going on with their family, because they have a lot of support with their family. Things are going okay with their family. This is important information because it may lead to something that they can then use when they talk about work stress or a stressful situation with their friend. But when you're getting more detail at the beginning, you may need to know more about the friend or more about the work situation, and it's less necessary to get more family information. How do you organize during your interview? Well, certainly you could take notes right in chronological order the way the client said them, but rather than doing that, it's helpful to develop a form which organizes the typical information that you would receive in a session with a client into different categories. And then you write the client's statements related to the categories on the part of the form that's devoted to that. So instead of writing all together one after the other, you're jumping around your form depending upon what the client is saying, because most clients aren't going to present their story in a nice organized way and only talk about one category thing at a time. It is also helpful to have a place to write information that may not quite fit in one of the form's categories, so that you do have a place to write it, even though it doesn't seem to fit as much, because all that information could wind up being important. What are helpful categories of information? Well, the client's description of the presenting problem, their current life situation at school, at work, their living circumstances, their finances, the types of daily activities they have, their family, their friends, personal characteristics such as their level of functioning. Mental health counselors could refer to this as mental status. Communication and problem solving, social skills, strengths and limitations. Writing down goals and planned or implemented interventions for resolving the presenting problem is also very important, and documenting that is part of showing what you're doing in terms of helping this client. I've included a suggested form for taking notes during a client interview, and it's helpful to review that form. It's downloadable from the list of readings or from the Writing Lab 1 instructions. Notice how the form is laid out and where the categories are placed. It's helpful to be familiar with the form because it's easier to take notes if you know where the categories are instead of having to search through the form for the correct space to write down your notes. Think about how the form can help you organize and analyze information and suggest questions that you need to ask. Because one of the things that happens when you have a form is if you see a big blank space in the form, you can say, wait a minute, I need to ask more information about that, and make sure that I ask the client more information about it. Okay, here are some tips for writing notes during client interviews, and you can use these notes to structure the interview. You can also use them to engage the client. When you take notes during the interview, it gives you a moment to consider what the client is saying. A practical tip is that it also communicates to clients that what they're saying is important. Indeed, there have been times where I've told the client, oh, that's a real important thing you're telling me. I'm going to write this in really big letters in my notes so I am sure to remember it. This is a very engaging way to help the client know that the notes that you're taking about them aren't secretive, aren't something that is going to paint them in a bad light, but is really a helpful tool for you. Which is another thing too, is if a client wants to see the notes that I'm taking, I generally show them the notes that I'm taking. I'm only summarizing what they say in these notes, and so none of what I write in the notes should be really surprising to them. Taking notes also helps the worker identifying missing information. As I said before, you can go through your notes and very easily see what are the categories of things that you haven't written down. And that's a little bit more difficult if you're just taking notes as the client says things. Some further tips for taking notes during the interview. Only use abbreviations or shortened forms that you will easily recognize later. Don't worry about spelling, punctuation, grammar, or full sentences. You'll focus on this when you write the formal note for the session. We'll talk about that in the next lesson. Use legible handwriting, or if you are one of those young people, kind of typing that, be careful of, typing errors or the self-correct and what that does to what you're typing in, particularly abbreviations and things. It can change the meaning significantly. Notes are useless if you can't read them afterwards. You also tend to get better with practice. So this is the end of Lesson 1. Review the following example, which illustrates the 3 steps in this lesson, and then practice what you learned in the writing lab. The example is an example of note-taking during an interview with a client named Scott Thompson. It'll give you some ideas about how you can also complete the Lesson 1 writing lab. After you've watched the example, you can consider what you've learned and the ideas that you wrote down in this lesson, and that'll help you complete the Lesson 1 writing lab.